So Mr. Kurt Hyde, this is his first time at Camp Constitution, all the way from Texas. He called me, I don't know, a couple of months ago and said he wanted to come. He said, I'm paying my own freight and all that. I said, great. I met him one time in 1988 or 89 at a Captive Nations Week event in New Hampshire. I think it was in Concord. Then he promptly moved away. He's Air Force retired.
Yes.
He's also a member of the John Birch Society's National Council, and I believe he may be one of the first, if not the first person in this country to sound the alarm about election fraud way back in the Stone Age in the 1980s. So let's give him a nice, warm Camp Constitution welcome.
I actually am the originator of the paper trail movement for electronic voting equipment. There were 3 people involved in coming up with the idea and working it out. I was one of those 3. Robert Geisenhainer, who's passed away, and William Williamson, who has also recently passed away, I believe. But we were the people who originally developed that. So that's why I go back. But by the way, the very first publication to advocate for a paper trail in our voting equipment was the New American, and I was the one who contributed to that. But that is how it is. Well, how about if we get going on this? I've done enough bragging about myself here. Make sure everybody can hear me pretty nicely. And what we're going to talk about first is a little bit about America's electoral heritage, okay? And the first thing I want to do, I want to thank you. Thank you all of you, for having voted my presentation as your favorite. Thank you. Hey. Yes, thank you. So how does Kurt know that, even though that vote hasn't been taken yet? Joke's on you. Even though it hasn't been taken yet. Well, that's because when they do take the votes, I've volunteered to help count them. Okay, enough of the humor for the day. And thanks for the applause. Now, let me see. One of the problems that we have, and it's in any kind of a country that's a republic, even a democracy, although we all know that this is a republic, not a democracy. But one of the problems that we have is that the people who run our elections have a conflict of interest in that they are hired by the people who have the most at stake in how the outcomes of those elections are going to be, isn't it? So, wow. And when you think about it, this is something that takes a lot of care. Okay, so anyway, let's see. All right, did I hit the wrong button? No, I did not. Okay, all right, pardon me on this one. Okay, I just got a couple of them out of order here, okay? But the people who hire the people who conduct the elections, those people have a stake in this. All right, now, why were America's elections earlier a lot better than they are now in many ways? Okay, for one of them, they had better methods, and we're going to talk about methods of voting. People like to talk about, if George Washington were here today, this is what he'd say. You know, he'd be so impressed with all the technology, the cars, the electronics. Okay, maybe so. If George Washington were to come here today and look at our elections, he would be appalled. He would really be. So we'll talk a little more about that. Okay, back then, it was open. Today, your people who run your elections will tell you that everything's open. It's all open to the public. It's all open. Well, we'll take a look and see. Maybe it isn't quite as open as they say it is. Now, people had a higher level of honesty back then. The church-going rate was a lot higher. The overall belief in Christianity or Judeo-Christianity was a lot higher then. So we had some advantages from that. We also had better methods of disputing elections. In 1788, the House Committee on Elections was the first standing committee to be to be organized by the very first Congress. Isn't that something? In 1947, they disbanded it. And there is a process now, but it is nowhere near as good as it used to be to resolve the dispute of a congressional election, just for examples. I would like to give you people a little history. I'll bet I saw earlier today you did voting by show of hands, didn't you? Yeah. Okay, that's cute, that's good, we have that. That shows up under voting by standing or hands. Does anybody here does anybody know what viva voce means?
My voice.
What?
My voice.
Live voice. That's right. You showed up and you gave them your name. You gave them your name, and they then wrote down your name and who you voted for. Permanent record was made. And I go searching around. Most people who own these things don't even know what they are, and they'll let them go for a pretty low price. And I have a pretty good collection of viva voce poll lists, is what they used to call them. But that was viva voce. That was the way that they voted in England at the time. They did not have a secret ballot in England. Okay, then there's voting by standing. And then there's also voting with the paper ballots. So, okay, like I said, that is the live voice, the written record. One of the nice things about viva voce voting was that they typically numbered it. In other words, let's say I showed up first and I voted for Thaddeus Williamson for something or something like that. They put a 1 in there, and the next person who voted for that same candidate would get a 2, then a 3. So how long did it take to count the votes? When the polls were closed, they were already counted. How many people here are familiar with the infamous 1948 Senate contest in Texas where Lyndon Johnson got the nickname Landslide Lyndon? Okay, yeah, well, all right. There were some extra names added to the voters list and all that. With viva voce voting, that sort of thing would be discovered immediately, all right? So viva voce voting was the safest from every form of election fraud except for one. Unfortunately, the idea of intimidation and retaliation is a serious problem, and so that's why we did away with it. Can you see that viva voce poll list in there? On the left-hand side, that's where the names of the voters are. And then you can see those are the people that they voted for. And in this particular one, if you really get up there close, you can see where it's a 1 followed by a 2 followed by a 3 and all that. But that was viva voce voting. Okay, now voting by standing would be a little, or show of hands. It'd be just a little different than what we saw this morning in many cases, all right? Voters could stand in line. People would also gather in groups in an open field. We get an open field. If we were to pull that election, have an election like that in here, we might have one candidate stand over here, another candidate stand over there. Anybody else who wants to be elected, no, those two. And then you would just gather up your groups around them. And sometimes it wasn't even necessary to count the votes. You could see. At that case, the expression that was used was, "I declare the choice upon the view." That would be how the person who conducted the election would say that. And depending on the state or the colony, there also was a chance for somebody to say, "I want an actual count." In other words, sometimes, but that's good. That's the kind of thing you need. Now, voting by ballot. And voting by ballot, if you saw the ballots, and in fact, you're actually going to get to see ballots from that era. Old ballots. I have them here from my collection. You wouldn't even recognize them if you saw them today, or I don't think you really would. Okay, here we go. if you can see it fairly well, I hope you can. This is a ticket. They were known as tickets, and you'll also notice that you didn't get to choose which one you're going to vote for. You grabbed the ticket that was for the political party or the candidate you wanted to vote for. And now, how secret was this as a secret ballot? Let's say these two were the ones who were running. Well, take a look on the back. One of them was printed on paper, just plain blank paper, and the other one was printed by a newspaper. And if a newspaper endorsed a certain candidate, then they would you cut that out of the newspaper, and you went on down and you voted for that. That's how you voted for your candidate. There we go. I'll put some of these things away now. But as you see, the secret ballot was not always found, because you could look at the back of it and you could see that it was the newspaper. It was recognizable. Okay. Now let's take a look at this. Whoop! Did I? Yeah. Okay. Some of those had to be handwritten by law. Does anybody here know the reason why? Aha. Was that hand raised, or are you just scratching your ear? Okay. Why did people require them to be handwritten? Don't you think it'd be a lot easier to count them if they were printed by a printer or something? Yeah, sure. Okay. People's attitudes toward... What's that? Okay. Let's hear it.
Because handwriting is an identifiable mark of the person. It was harder to commit voter fraud when it was written by the person.
Can you speak louder, please? I can't understand. I couldn't.
Handwriting was another way to identify the person, the writer, because it was their identifiable trademark.
Okay, well that was around back in those days, but the real reason why it had to be handwritten, and listen to this, you don't hear anybody talking about things like this today. You ready? That had to be handwritten because they did not trust a voter who would let who would let someone else do his thinking for him. Don't let anybody do your thinking for you was the attitude. And therefore, if you hand me something that was printed by some printer and you walked up there with like 6 or 8 choices on it, you let someone else do your thinking for you. You were agreeable to it. Okay, I admit that. It was not a stolen ballot, but that is how sincere these people were. They said, if you can't sit down and write down the name of each candidate, then I don't trust that you've really thoughtfully thought through your vote. Isn't that, I mean, you don't hear that kind of thinking today. You don't hear anything like that. But they had to be handwritten for that. Eventually, the pre-printed ballots were allowed. Part of that was caused by the political parties. They used to hold like little get-togethers, and everybody's going to make out all of these handwritten tickets, okay? And so therefore, people were still walking up with tickets that someone else wrote. It was in handwriting, not necessarily theirs, and so finally they relented and they said, well, we're going to allow pre-printed ballots to come in. And then came the Australian-style ballot. Does anybody know what the Australian ballot is? Have you heard about it? Every now and then you hear people talking about the Australian ballot. Okay, the Australian ballot, the idea was in Australia, they came up with the idea of why don't we pre-print the ballot with all the choices on it, pre-print the ballot in such a way that it can be folded to conceal how the voter voted. Excuse me. And then the ballot could be folded, and that would give you a good secret ballot. It was an improvement in the secret ballot. There's not enough time to go into it right now, but in my book that I just recently completed, I think a few more edits on this, I also go into the dark side of the Australian ballot because it has been a mixture of bad as well as good. There's been some bad that came in along with it. Another thing we have is called the Electoral College. Now, most of you people here will really defend the Electoral College, correct? Most of us do. And I do too. And I've done some thinking about it, and the more I think about it, the more I study it, the more I realize how good it really is. It's very imperfect. Very imperfect, I admit that. But boy, I'll tell you, we really need it, okay? They did not want the executive to be voted on by the legislature. They didn't want, that was pork barrel politics, and they didn't like that. A nationwide popular vote. How many people here, today people talk about the nationwide popular vote, right? You hear that. Did you know that was just totally out of the question? Totally out of the question. All right, I'll give you some reasons. There were differences in voter qualifications. In a state like Virginia, where it was more difficult to meet the qualifications, or a state like Connecticut, where it was easier to meet those qualifications, you would have an imbalance in which state had more power than the other if it were a nationwide popular vote. And can anybody here guess which state would have been the granddaddy of them all for getting more influence per? No? Okay. This is a trivia question that almost nobody knows. Don't tell the people from Wyoming, but the first place where women could vote in this country was New Jersey. The women did. Oh, here's to the ladies. Okay, I didn't hear that. Okay, but in any case, when our country was first founded, the women voted in New Jersey. Unfortunately, there was a really nasty, dirty election in 1807, and they lost the vote in there. And I don't think the women deserved all the blame, but they did, but they're the ones who suffered it. But in any case, New Jersey would have had twice as many ballots, so to speak. They would have had twice the voting power if there was a nationwide popular vote, right? Okay, another problem is this. If you'll take a look at this, you'll see there isn't a single election, other than elections that are held in Congress, that cross a state line. Think about it. And they didn't want a centralized voting authority. All this stuff that the federal government is doing, that these federal courts are doing, these are all things that our founding fathers warned us against, and guess what? They were right. We're proving them right, but I wish we could find some other way to prove them right. But in any case, they did not want that. And by the way, a nationwide recount, that would have been a disaster. That would have been, that would have been just beyond. So, the Electoral College was meant to be a temporary body. The U.S. Constitution says each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature may direct. Did you know in the first couple elections for president, some of the state legislatures appointed the electors directly from the legislature rather than going to an election to the people? Well, that's exactly where that comes from. Okay. The Electoral College worked as planned. It was meant to work like a search committee. And it worked perfectly for the first two presidential elections. And things have gone downhill ever since. The first two elections, they elected George Washington to be the president both times. Everything worked out perfectly because the perfect or close to perfect candidate was there. Okay, what about the third electoral? Now, the old Electoral College rules, you might, if you've ever looked at the 12th Amendment, you see this huge amendment. It's practically like a whole new section. Well, that's because it was. But the old way was every elector cast 2 votes. And then whoever got the biggest total was the president. Whoever got the second biggest total was the vice president. That's a little different than what we do now. Right now you cast 2 votes, but one is for president and the other is for the vice president. And look at what happened. Look at what happened in 1796. Our third presidential election, it was John Adams and Thomas Stickney for the Federalists. And it was Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr for the Democratic Republicans, okay? So who got the top votes? Well, the top vote total went to John Adams. Who came in second? Thomas Jefferson. So this is like having the Republican be the president and the Democratic nominee be the vice president. I mean, that's essentially what happened. Well, that was a bit of a problem. Then things got worse. In 1800, we had our fourth presidential election. It was Thomas Jefferson and his running mate, Aaron Burr. How many people here have heard of Aaron Burr? He's considered to be one of the scoundrels of American history. And he showed himself to be just that, because he wound up in a tie with his running mate, and he said, well, I want to be president then. I mean, that would really be something, wouldn't it, huh? So he did, and it took 36 votes in the Congress, in the House of Representatives, 36 votes before, fortunately, they gave us Thomas Jefferson. Okay, then the 12th Amendment was ratified in 1804, and now they cast the two. Okay, well, that's a little bit about the elector here. Okay, voter qualifications. How many people here have heard the expression, back then you had to own property in order to vote? Have you heard that before? Well, not quite. That's close. What it was in many states or many colonies, you had to own property to vote, but you didn't have to in all. Remember, we're all different states. We have different voter qualifications. Like so what were the voter qualifications in Massachusetts and Connecticut? They were different. Boy, they were different. So in any case, they still wanted to see the voters' worthiness. They also wanted to see a long-term commitment. Now, owning of property is a long-term commitment, right? And sometimes the property ownership would be something like, this would be 5 acres of land with a house and a barn on it, or the equivalent. And believe me, that's when life got complicated. What is the equivalent of 5 acres of land with a house and a barn on it? Does anybody here think that Benjamin Franklin, with his print shop, do you think he should have voted? I think so. Well, he had the equivalent with his beautiful print shop. I'm not sure if Pennsylvania was a 5 acres of land place, but okay. There was a net worth. In New Jersey, you had to have a provable net worth of 40 British pounds. It was known as a 40-pound stake. And that was a good one. That was a good, you want to vote? Prove to me that you can manage your own finances. Then I will trust you to manage the public money. That was the basic theory behind it. If you could not accumulate a 40-pound stake, then I don't think we can trust you with public money, or to be the one in charge. So these are the philosophies of that time. George Washington believed in those, or people in George Washington's time, and I'm sure George Washington did too, believe in those things. Eventually, it kind of came down to age, and by the way, in some states, it used to be 25 to vote. And 21 was the overwhelming majority on that one end there. Eventually, it was age of residency and literacy. And we're going to get into a little bit of fun here. And this is a little pamphlet that was published in the middle 1940s, okay? And what it was, it had to do with the status of the African Americans and getting to vote in Virginia. In a lot of southern states, if you showed up and you were African American, and I hope I'm using the right words or whatever, if you did, they would just say you flunked the literacy test, right? It was done. That's not a proud chapter in our history. That's how it was done. Well, there is a proud chapter in that. The end of the chapter was what they did in New Jersey was they said very simply, I think, any registrar that refused to register somebody who was qualified was guilty of a misdemeanor, okay? And if you were denied because of literacy, you were allowed to ask that the literacy test be done again in court. You didn't have to hire a lawyer, you didn't have to file a lawsuit, you didn't have to do all those things that make lawyers rich just getting the thing started. You just said, I believe I'm literate. This person said I was not literate. I want to retake the literacy test in court. Guess what? That's all it took. And it virtually wiped it out in Virginia. So we didn't need the federal action, which I believe is unconstitutional with the Voting Rights Act, that made it illegal to use any form of literacy test. You see, because the literacy tests that we had, there were unfair literacy tests. There's no doubt about that. But this way, we attacked the unfair literacy tests. And I think a lot of that has to do with people who love to register people and people who don't even exist. There's something else into here, and I have a feeling I'm not getting very exciting today. I'm seeing people with their heads moving around, so I'm going to try to do the best I can to keep this lively. Sorry about this, I seem to have caught a little cold up here too. But anyway, I have a nice little book, and I had a beautiful PDF made of it. And the election laws of the state of New York in 1871, and it was really interesting. Because you announce the beginning of the polls, you say, by the way, it's open to the public, and the public is reminded not to interfere with the election. Okay? Now, okay, at first you say, all right, is that how polls are opened today? And a lot of you people here haven't voted yet, and you may not be aware of it. In just about every state now in the United States, it is illegal for anybody to be there except for people who are voting or people who are working on the election and first responders, a couple others. It's illegal to be there. Is that open? Is that open to the public? No, it isn't. They'll say it's open to the public. All you have to do is ask to be an official election observer, right? You ought to see what you have to go through to be an election observer in some states. Yep. Okay. The election laws, when they close the polls, and they would then say that the vote count must begin immediately and the count must be public. In other words, you can actually stand there and watch as the votes are being counted. And any member of the public could. That's an open election. That's the thing George Washington would say, your election isn't open. I can't just walk in and see it. Okay? This is a good one. People might remember this in 2020. Once they started, the vote count had to be completed. You couldn't take 12 hours off and then say, guess what happened? Well, everybody stopped. In any case in here. And then you have to give all the totals. And this is really interesting. The totals must be proclaimed publicly. The number, you have to say how many voters checked in. And then you have to say how many ballots were cast. And then, and if there was a difference in those two numbers, there had to be a reason, okay? You'd give the number of unusable ballots, and then the vote totals for each candidate. And all that information was public. It was made public immediately. So here is a typical election from the late 1800s, okay? This is a typical election. This is a picture of it. And let's see if, because I think we're going to come to the Q&A section here pretty soon. We're going to have we're going to have part 2 of this right after this, okay? So let's see. I think I'm close to halfway through here. But let's take a look at this. This is a typical election in the late 1800s. This is a lithograph. It's a pretty famous lithograph. You can find it on the internet. It's all over the place. All right. Can you identify anything in this picture that implies or that really makes a statement regarding some of the security features of our early elections? I know I'm kind of surprising you, and very few people study elections, you know. I guess I'm one of those weirdos. But anyway, take a look at that picture, all right? I'll give you the first hint. The first hint is look at that huge crowd. You see the huge crowd of people? Do you think all those people got all the necessary signatures to be election observers? No. Because You didn't have to be appointed as an election observer. What did it take to be an election observer in the in the 1870s? This was probably taken in New York. This was probably in New York, but it might have been Philadelphia or Boston, but it's a big city, and it's back in that era. Now, so, again, my apologies for that cough. Anyway, so you got this huge crowd. What does it take to be an observer? Well, you got to walk in and look. Yeah, nothing is kind of right. What do you have to do in order to get to be an observer of the election? All you had to do is just not interfere. Just anybody who wanted to see what's going on. Okay, so that's number one. There are 3 of them in particular in here. Anybody see what those ballot boxes are made out of? I heard somebody say it. Glass. Yeah, I heard a number of people say it. It's glass. Part of that was to show how transparent the process was. Glass ballot boxes were very popular. Glass ballot boxes. Okay? And there's also a third one that is probably very subtle, and I don't blame anybody here for not getting it, okay? And that is, if you, oh, yes?
Looks like somebody's keeping tab, writing down.
That's right. That man is probably the one who's keeping track of who came in to vote. That man on the left-hand side, our left-hand side, yes, he's probably the one writing down who it is who came in to vote so that we keep track of who voted. Yes. Yeah, well, that is good that we wrote it down, I suppose. So, yeah. But in any case, there's another one. There's another one in there. And this one is really very subtle. It is still practiced in New Hampshire with their paper ballots, whenever they vote with paper ballots. Anybody here know what? Do you? Yeah.
There's somebody watching the guy putting it in the box.
Right. What is that? Here's,
We have that in Maine.
Right. What happened in these cases was that in order to cast the ballot, you would present your ballot to the moderator or the election judge, whatever the title is for that, or to the election clerk, perhaps, whatever the title is in these states, or in that state over there. He, without taking away the secrecy of your secret ballot, he would actually take a look at that, make sure there was only one ballot. Make sure only one ballot was cast. That's his job, but that was done in front of you. So you hand him your ballot, and right in front of me, I hand this to, and he goes, and then it goes into the ballot box, okay? So that's part of what we used to do. And boy, that is, and so, okay, note the crowd, note the glass ballot boxes, and note that the election official is doing what we discussed. Okay. Are there any questions so far? That shows that I've bored you. I'm sorry about that. Let's go forward, and we may have a little more time for Q&A at the end of the next one. Okay, how many people here have heard of Tammany Hall? Aha, I see a few hands go. Oh yeah, a few hands go up. Tammany Hall was the whole idea of Tammany Hall. It was, I think it was an Irish club. But pretty soon it became the place where Boss Tweed met with the guys, and that was the real government of the city of New York. Those guys that were down there at the city council doing all those meetings, they were just puppets for what was done at Tammany Hall. Well, Tammany Hall was a corrupt political machine in all kinds of ways. They did corrupt political elections. They did corrupt work with contracts that are just, I mean, it is infamous, Tammany Hall is, okay? Now, Boss Tweed got convicted of the corruption charges. And so what did they do to put Tammany Hall out of business? See, this is the kind of thing, we don't have people talking like this these days. What did they do? They said, we are now going to run one election per year in New York City. So everybody's going to be on your congressman, your governor, the mayor, the city council. There's only going to be one election per year. Everybody's going to be on the ballot all at once. Okay. Now what they did is they usually went with 30 days, but they also went a couple times with slightly shorter times. But let's go with 30 days. They would close off the election registrations at 30 days before that election. Okay? During that 30 days, a police officer would verify every single voter registration in the city of New York. That was a pretty busy month. No, but that was the era of the cop on the beat. How many people here are familiar with that? Cop on the beat. There used to be a local police officer. He was out walking around. He was wearing a police officer type uniform, and that was the cop on the beat. So his job during that final month was to, to knock on the door, hello, Mrs. O'Flaherty, this is Officer Murphy. I'm here to check to see that Mr. O'Flaherty, he's registered to vote. Does he still live here? Yes, he does. Okay, thank you. All right. That's how it was done. And right now they'll say, oh, that's police state and all that. No, it isn't police state. If these people were really against police state, they'd be going to an airport to make sure people aren't being mistreated. But they had one election per year. The voter registration was done 100% verification, all right? That was a big part of how Tammany Hall was destroyed. The corruption of Tammany Hall was put out of business. Okay? And part of it was the elections. That's how they killed the election frauds. Okay. As I have studied elections, and I've been at this now for quite a few years, since the middle 1980s, I've been doing this. One of the things that I've noticed is that when America's elections were first started, when our country was new, our elections were actually pretty good, okay? Now, the votes were cast and counted in public, except in one state. Can anybody here guess which of the original 13 states the people didn't always get to see their votes counted in public? It took until about 1818 when they rewrote the Connecticut Constitution to say that those votes had to be counted in public. And there were certain votes that weren't, and the Federalists were, it became a big political football. And the reason why I can say it's the only one is because I ran across some news article in the era around 1818 where they said, finally Connecticut caught up to everybody else. Okay, so that's what it was. So anyway, the votes were cast, they were counted in public by 1818. That included all of the states, which is more than 13 also at that point. But there was decentralized authority. Voter registration lists were used. That's an interesting thing, because voter registration lists were actually a pretty new idea. The first voter registration lists that I've been able to find were 1838 in Baltimore. Up until then, it was, they took your word for it, and in most towns, people walked to the end. People knew who you were, and people walked. You didn't have the ability to move around quickly like you can right now. But those were what we gradually got better and better. Connecticut caught up to everybody on the secret ballot. Viva Voce was kind of done away with. In fact, one of the states that led the way, this is different than it is right now. We'll get into it later, but we'll get into some of the things. Massachusetts was an innovative state for really improving their elections at that time. And then some downhill slides began. How many people, okay, let's see, we're about ready to break right now. How about if we break right now?